Briahna Gray, everyone, former Bernie Sanders press secretary, former Intercept political editor, and now with Current Affairs. And she wrote a great piece called In Defense of Litmus Tests, and that deals with a lot of what we're talking about. And you argue that it's not helping the Dems defeat Trump to not push Biden to the left.
Yeah, I think the crucial observation, I think that everyone who is a leftist, who identified with progressive movements, the Bernie campaign, the subtext to everyone who tells us that we need to stop pushing Biden, the subtext to everyone who tells us that we're somehow voting for Trump if we levy any criticism in Biden's direction, is that if Biden were to concede to the demands of the left, and which are in fact the demands of the overwhelming majority of Democrats, and in many cases the majority of Americans, regardless of political party, that it would somehow disadvantage him in the general election contest, right? So the push is to say, don't say anything at all about Biden because you are enabling Trump's victory by doing so. But the reality is, when you look at the fact that when you go down policy proposal after policy proposal, prescription after prescription, that overwhelming majorities of people actually want Biden to do those things, then it becomes clear that the issue, the factor that is skewing the election for Trump is not in fact us asking for these basic things from Biden, but Biden's refusal to acquiesce. And so if we are to raise these issues and Biden chooses not to respond by embracing these overwhelmingly popular policies, the onus is on him in the general election. But what they're doing is flipping the script and pretending that we live in a world where we're asking for radical, bizarre things that would somehow disadvantage him. And in doing so, they're able to silence what is an overwhelming supermajority of Americans who are living through a time of unprecedented crisis, frankly, where the need for things like Medicare for all, decriminalization of marijuana have never been more obvious. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to start shifting that burden and being really clear about the fact that what we're asking for is, in fact, for Biden to position himself better against Trump by drawing stronger contrasts and advocating for the policies that average Americans want.
That's the most sensible thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Honestly, I mean, God.
And to that point, I think people have like understandable PTSD from Trump's win, even people who are very critical of Biden from the left and were Bernie people. But I think some people have like internalized guilt as if it's their fault for supporting the candidate who would have won. I think obviously we don't know, but I always thought that he was more electable than Hillary Clinton. Not always. Once he started running and went from 3% name recognition or whatever he started at. But that I think a lot of people, like you say, they automatically concede or prematurely have conceded their support, and they kind of announce it. And you, Brie, you recall this amazing moment where Elizabeth Warren was at the debates, and she said, "I'd like to talk about who we're running against, a billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg." And then you say it was a sharp and effective volley, but the impact was dimmed somewhat by the disclaimer uttered in the same breath. Quote, "I'll support whoever the Democratic nominee is," end quote. So yeah. What is that? People feeling pressure? Is that their genuine belief that they really need to say that? And again, even if you're prepared to vote blue, no matter who, why are people advertising it?
Right. So this gets down to this question of leverage. And for the average voter, the consequences, the positioning of people who are in Congress is a little bit different than the average voter.
Right.
Literally, the only leverage we have in the world is our vote. And that example was particularly important to me because the fidelity pledge to vote blue no matter who, even if it were Michael Bloomberg, was extracted from people, from voters and candidates alike, so long before it was anything near an inevitability that Michael Bloomberg would be in the race. So by conceding so early that you would be willing to vote for a candidate like that, you're basically accepting, you're putting out into the world that voters should consider him to be a legitimate, viable Democratic candidate, which from my perspective, he should never have been. He is someone who was a Republican until recently, and who wasn't just a Republican in name, as though that's like fundamentally toxic in that itself, but the policies that he supported were conservative. He is the poster child for a racially motivated stop and frisk policy in New York City, but what makes him maligned across the state and beyond for anybody who ever had the misfortune of having to exist here as a Black and brown person in a certain age bracket. You know, I've witnessed my brother be stopped and frisked during the time period as someone who moved to New York as a teenager in 2001. So, you know, the idea that now we're in the middle of a massive movement for Black lives, where criminal justice reform is front and center on the minds of millions of Americans. We had people plausibly discussing Michael Bloomberg as a candidate, was incredibly bizarre, especially when we had so many eligible, exciting candidates at play. And so imagine a world in which all of the rest of the candidates had been united in their response and said, frankly, I don't think that Michael Bloomberg deserves to be on this stage. Frankly, I don't think that he should be in any way considered to be a legitimate representative of the Democratic Party. But by not doing so, Democrats increasingly allow their brand to be co-opted and shift us farther and farther to the right. And every year, and this is something I argue in the piece, every year Democrats say that we are up against the most fascistic, right-wing, threatening Republican candidate in our lives. And the fact of the matter is, more often than not, they're right. But there's a reason why we are always in this position. And it's because we never outline any kind of floor, any kind of barrier, any kind of litmus test that should satisfy Democratic voters before they're willing to throw their vote at just anyone. And the consequence of that is that we go farther and farther and farther to the right, because the literal floor of the Democratic Party is just a hair's breadth above Donald Trump's head. And that's not where we should be. It's not where we need to be. And in fact, I think by doing that, by allowing Joe Biden to run and ignore policies and also make choices like having so many corporate lobbyists, healthcare lobbyists, et cetera, so close to him and his senior advisor team, he's opening himself up to criticisms that are going to be legitimate from Trump that we've seen him leverage at Hillary Clinton in 2016. And also he's abandoning a whole suite of policy proposals that could get him the kind of excitement, volunteer-based investment, donor base, that's a non-corporate, non-super PAC donor base, that Bernie Sanders enjoyed, and would in fact make him a more electable candidate. So in my view, the people who are enabling Trump, the people who are making it easier for him to win and harder for Biden, are the folks that are holding Biden to such a low standard.